Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. As part of AJC's State of Anti-Semitism in America 2024 report, AJC and Hillel International partnered to document Jewish students' experiences during their time on campus last year. The report found that 43% of Jewish college students avoided expressing their views about Israel on campus or to classmates because of fears of anti-Semitism. 22% of Jewish students report feeling or being excluded from a group or an event on campus because they're Jewish. And 32% of American Jewish students said they have felt uncomfortable or unsafe at a campus event because of their Jewish identity. Here to share their perspective on the ground are two students who have become advocates for their Jewish peers. Evan Cohen, a senior computer science major at the University of Michigan, is the vice chair of Hillel International's Israel Leadership Network. And Daniel Solomon, a junior political science and urban studies major at Brown University, who serves on AJC's Campus Global Board. Evan, Daniel, welcome to People of the Pod.
I, wish it was under better circumstances, but, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, gentlemen, I just read a bunch of findings from the most recent report. Do they seem too high or too low based on your national vantage points? Evan?
So, I think these findings are sadly not that surprising. We've seen and experienced an unprecedented amount of anti-Semitism over the past year and a half, give or take. Clearly, it's rising. Clearly, students are experiencing this on their campuses, myself included. I definitely think that, there's probably some cases where students are experiencing it more. In some cases, it's less. But I think, in general, it's way too high. Like, we should not be seeing this much anti-Semitism on campuses.
And Daniel, what do you think?
The numbers seem about right. I have the opportunity of helping lead AJC's Campus Global Board, which really has a very wide perspective across the world and also across the United States. And we recently just met as a board in Lisbon where we discussed at length new trends over the past year in college anti-Semitism and around the world. And this really holds. We really found that this data is reflective of what we find in our qualitative experiences.
One finding I did not just share at the beginning is that roughly 35% of American Jewish college students or recent graduates report having personally experienced anti-Semitism at least once during their time on campus. Did either of you have a personal encounter of your own over the past year?
So a number of months ago, I was walking through the center of campus with a rabbi and a friend of mine, and we were spat at. And the unfortunate reality is not only were we spat at, but when I tried to report this, I was basically told that without identifying the individual by name, there was nothing that the university could do. And this was extremely frustrating because we were spat at, and that was a deeply upsetting experience. It's something that no one should have to go through just for being Jewish. But the fact that there was almost nothing that could be done about it besides, maybe, here's how we can support you, which was not something that I was particularly in need of. It was disappointing to see that there was no strong response to that.
So shortly after October 7th, my friends and I in our apartment, we held a small gathering and, some friends brought mutual friends and their friends brought mutual friends, which is totally fine. And so someone who I didn't know came up to me and looked at my door frame, and I have a mezuzah on my door frame. And she said, "Is that your Jew thing?" Which, yes, it is, but it's called a mezuzah. And she said, "Well, are you a good Jew or a bad Jew?" And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And I knew exactly what she meant by that. She meant, "Are you a Zionist? Are you an anti-Zionist Jew?" And the conversation ended shortly thereafter, and we asked her if she would leave.
This report came after the protests and the encampments that roiled college campuses, mostly in the spring of 2024. Of the Jewish students who witnessed anti-Israel demonstrations after the October 7th terrorist attacks, 51% said that these protests or encampments made them feel unsafe on campus. How did your universities handle the encampments that popped up on your campuses?
There was an encampment on our campus. It sprung up the morning of the first Passover Seder of last year. And I remember receiving a text at 6 a.m. or something. I woke up. The first message I saw was, "Evan, do you know what's going on?" And I said, oh my God, another thing to deal with. It's about to be Passover. Like, we're supposed to be preparing for the Seder. And, I think that at our university it was handled extremely poorly. We were told the encampment is contained, and yet it grew in size. So at first it took over the main part of the center of the Diag, which is the main center of campus area at the University of Michigan, and slowly it crept out into farther and farther areas of that center of campus Diag. And it was really disappointing because at the end of the year, when it's finally warm, students are out there, they're hammocking, they're playing sports, even just reading and studying. And at that point, there was nobody besides those in the encampment. And so it really destroyed the end of year atmosphere that everyone always looks forward to. And again, like I said, I think it was handled very poorly. The university did not contain it. The university waited until after graduation. They were hoping, I believe they were hoping, that if they waited until after graduation, there wouldn't be disruptions at the graduation. Well, I personally did not graduate last spring. I had friends who did, and there were disruptions at that graduation. So clearly, that strategy did not work, did not pay off. Sometime after graduation, they announced that the encampment was being removed because of fire hazards. Now, these fire hazards were hazards the entire time the encampment was there. I saw students plugging in various electronic devices, keeping themselves warm with space heaters. That's not something that you're supposed to be able to do there. And I do have experience because I've had to reserve that space for, pro-Israel activities in the past. And so I very much understand first what the rules and regulations are and how that process works. Very clearly, these rules were violated. And not only that, there was clear anti-Semitic imaging and speech that was spewing out of this encampment.
So first and foremost, our campus is a very big advocate of free speech, just collectively. So, when the encampment originally went up, the university made sure to emphasize the fact that, it is free speech, but free speech, has consequences in the sense that setting up an encampment is against the university policy. So within those guidelines, the encampment was up for probably a day or two. And then I remember one evening, the members of the encampment started yelling to globalize the Intifada. And this was sort of the call, on the university's end to say, this is actually not okay. This is when it teeters on free speech and free expression and, voicing your opinions, however different they might be than most. This is actually when it gets into hate speech. And so that's sort of the moment that our university leadership really took control of the encampment, and it ended shortly thereafter.
Of course, most anti-Semitic content and the anti-Israel vitriol is primarily spread online and on social media, and the data back that up. Almost 7 in 10 American Jews, 67%, reported seeing or hearing anti-Semitism online or on social media in the past 12 months. The number jumps to 83% for young American Jews between the ages of 18 and 29, so your peers. How has social media, the digital landscape, shaped your encounters with anti-Semitism?
Social media is a big part of our generation and a part of how we bond together. Similar to other universities, Brown has a platform called SideChat. Other universities, it might be called Yik Yak or something else. But the only way to access this app, which is a private company, not affiliated with Brown, but the only way to actually access the Brown-only channel in SideChat is to use your Brown email. So it's sort of an anonymous message board where anyone can post whatever they feel, whatever they think. Sometimes it's funny memes. Sometimes it's satire. In the context of the post-October 7th world on Brown's campus, it was nothing but, atrocious, really. It was really just a cesspool and a hotbed of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric that absolutely veered into anti-Semitism, but also really just classic flat-out anti-Semitism, pointing out Jews in great positions of authority in the country and on college campuses specifically, and sort of trying to connect dots that really aren't connectable. And so SideChat was really just a really terrible hotbed of anti-Semitism. And then also, those who were more bold anti-Semites would really just blatantly, leave comments in Instagram posts, with their profile name visible so you knew exactly who they are. The digital landscape was absolutely a pretty crucial part of what comprised the anti-Semitism happening. As I mentioned before, the campus that we see now is really the one that I remember, in my freshman year, the one that I made some of my closest friends on, the one where I developed some of my academic ambitions. The campus that I really fell in love with is the one that I'm seeing now, and much different than the situation that we were in last year.
I could talk about, two specific examples. One example was the president of our SJP chapter, sometime, I want to say around last March, posted something to her personal public account that said something along the lines of death to everyone who supports the Zionist state, death and more, death and worse. And I believe that Regent Acker, who was on the podcast relatively recently, actually spoke about this, I think. And that was deeply disappointing to see because, studies have shown, I even read a study recently, I think it said about 80% of American Jews support Israel, meaning they believe in Zionism, the right for Israel to exist safely and securely, for Jews to live there in our ancestral homeland. And so to say that, that's basically calling for the death of Jews, the death of fellow classmates, fellow students. So that was extremely challenging to see and to deal with. And ultimately, there were effectively no consequences. The student graduated last spring, and we saw no repercussions from this activity. Another example of online anti Semitism I experienced was during a trip to Israel last May. As part of this trip, I was going to be bearing witness to the atrocities of October 7th, and me and another student from the university were sharing some of our experiences, and a screenshot was taken of us, and then over on top of it were overlaid messages like settler scum, and these students are celebrating genocide.
Evan, how have these encounters, both on campus, with the encampments, and on social media, how have they informed your time working with Hillel on an international level?
It's very clear that anti-Semitism is extremely prevalent. It's clear that anti-Zionism, anti-Israel sentiment is very prevalent, and that we need to be constantly working toward combating it and supporting students. On different campuses, this manifests in different ways. So it requires different tactics, different strategies, depending on what school you're at, depending on what your individual needs are. But now being in this leadership position, it's amazing to try to offer that support and use my experiences to then help other students on their campuses deal with the troubles that they are going through and what they are experiencing.
I want to point out that a lot of this happened after the October 7th terrorist attack. A lot of what you're talking about, of course, the survey itself. But anti-Semitism doesn't just come from anti-Israel corners. And Evan, I know there were instances of demonstrators waving Nazi flags in Howell and Fowlerville outside a production of The Diary of Anne Frank. Those are small towns about 30 or 40 miles away from Ann Arbor. Have there been expressions of anti-Semitism from the far right on Michigan's campus?
I think it was like the 2022-2023 academic year, students received hate mail specifically targeting Jews, saying that Jews run the media, that they're responsible for COVID, messages similar to that. I want to say that was even around the high holidays timeframe. And so this was found passed out around off-campus student housing. And so a number of students received messages like that. We also saw post-October 7th swastikas on or near Jewish buildings, for example, at Hillel one time. And so we're definitely seeing anti-Semitism from both sides.
And Daniel, your campus anti-Semitism task force, for lack of a better term, it initially formed in response to hatred from the far right. Is that right? Or is that correct?
So when I was a freshman, in my freshman fall, a terrible anti-Semitic threat was sent to the campus rabbi and executive director of the Brown RISD Hillel that serves both Brown University and the Rhode Island School of Design. And that's sort of where we sort of came together and started really having very proactive and very productive meetings with Brown's administration. Partially, I will plug just a little bit that I think that part, the reason why I was so zealous to get involved was the training I received with the American Jewish Committee, with the LIFT program, the Leaders for Tomorrow high school program. So we really came together, started having these conversations with Brown's administration, and created this really, really positive relationship, which I think is a pretty hallmark component of being a Brown student, is this really great relationship that we formed. And I think that, leading into October 7th, part of what made Brown's response so effective was that we had this really dynamic relationship with administrators already. And that, there's really no gap between Brown's institutional Jewish leaders and Brown's administration. We have, an incredibly supportive administration. And I think that was something that we saw following the incident in fall of 2022, and something that we continue to see all throughout, the post-October 7th world.
And Daniel, I'll ask you the same question I just asked Evan. How has that experience on Brown's campus, informed your time on AJC's Campus Global Board?
To be honest, it's actually a little bit of the opposite. I feel as though my time on AJC's Campus Global Board has really provided such an incredible opportunity to understand the global landscape of campus anti-Semitism. And also, of course, we want to emphasize the global landscape of Jewish joy that's happening on college campuses, because that is definitely not in short supply.
I'm curious, do you get questions from your peers back home, your younger peers, questions about whether or not your campuses are the right choice, the right fit for them?
I think it's really important to mention that the Jewish students on campus do absolutely have a home here. We're working extremely hard to ensure that there is Jewish joy on campus, and there are organizations here to support Jewish students. It's imperative that Jews come to campus, that we continue to build a supportive community, and that, we're not just hiding, we're not just shying away from this. We're actively working towards improving campus, and campus is drastically improved in the 2024-2025 school year compared to the 23-24 school year. So we're standing strong, we're standing proud, and we're not going to back down. There's a thriving Jewish community, and we're here to support you. We want you to come here. The University of Michigan has such a large Jewish population, in part because a long time ago, the Ivy League schools had quotas on the number of Jews who could attend. And so the University of Michigan did not. As such, we have a very strong Jewish community here, and I highly recommend coming here, as long as you can bear and withstand the cold.
Thank you both for joining us and reflecting on the difficulties of 2024. May 2025 be more peaceful on your campuses.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for having me.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for part 1 of our Faces Behind Anti-Semitism series. Hear from the University of Michigan Regent Jordan Acker, whose home and law office were targeted last year by anti-Israel and anti-Semitic protesters. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.